Welcome students to exercise 32, which is focusing on the anatomy of our circulatory or vascular system, the anatomy of our blood vessels. The two pictures here you see on the screen are from the bodies exhibit. The blood vessel part of the bodies exhibit is probably my favorite part. What they've done here is they've injected the blood vessels with plastic and then dissolved all of the rest of the muscle and bone and nervous tissue, pretty much all of the rest of the body tissue, all the visceral organs, all of that gets dissolved, leaving nothing pretty much but the blood vessels. And yet you can still basically see a human shape in it. I think that's just unbelievably incredible, and it's so neat to see just how many blood vessels we have in our body. So the whole kind of purpose of our vascular system, of our circulatory system, is it's how everything moves around the body, whether it's oxygen going from the lungs to all the body tissues that need it in order to do metabolism, whether it's the carbon dioxide that they make as a result of aerobic respiration that has to get back to the lungs to be gotten rid of, to be excreted and exhaled, whether it's a hormone going from the endocrine organ that makes it to its target organ, whether it's all the metabolic products that your body makes at one part but needs in another part, or the waste products that your body needs to either filter out at the kidneys or exhale at the lungs. All of this stuff has to move through the body, and it does so through the vascular system. It is a closed loop system. We're going to start at the heart and end at the heart. Taking blood away from the heart is our arterial system, which consists of the larger arteries, which then branch into the smaller arterioles. The arterioles then lead into the capillaries, where all the exchange of oxygen and nutrients and wastes and carbon dioxide and hormones and all of that takes place. And then coming out of the capillaries are the venules. They're kind of like smaller quote-unquote veins. The venules then merge with the larger and larger veins, which then eventually bring the blood eventually back to the vena cava and to the heart. So it's kind of a closed loop. Pretty much every organ in your body just about has a capillary bed. There are some rare exceptions like your cornea and your irises, your cartilaginous tissues, the epithelial tissues, but pretty much everywhere else in your body has a capillary. That's why those pictures in the bodies exhibit are so cool. So arteries are always carrying blood away from the heart. Always, always, always. So they're conducting and distributing the blood to all of your body's organs and tissues. So I think of them as kind of the supply side of this whole equation. The arterioles are known as resistance vessels. They can vasodilate and vasoconstrict to help kind of regulate your blood pressure, and then to also kind of control how much blood gets into a specific organ, because it's the arterioles that actually lead into the capillary beds. And so by changing their diameter, if they get bigger, they can let more blood into that organ. If they get smaller, they can get less blood into that organ. And so they help regulate that process too. The capillaries, of course, as I said, is where all the exchange takes place. If you want to get a hormone that has traveled from the hypothalamus and now needs to be absorbed by the anterior pituitary is going to do so through its capillary bed. Venules come out of the capillary beds, and then they merge finally into the veins, which are always carrying blood toward the heart and kind of away from all the other organs. And so I think of them as kind of the drainage side of all of this. They're also known as capacitance vessels. At any given time, most of your blood volume is probably present in the venous system as opposed to the arterial system. So if we look at kind of the structure of our blood vessels, they are hollow organs, so they do have a lumen, they're a tube, and then the walls of the blood vessels have three layers, three tunics. The kind of most superficial of the tunics. The innermost tunic is the tunica intima. It's basically endothelial, epithelial tissue with a little bit of connective tissue underneath. Makes a nice smooth surface so that the blood flows kind of smoothly without encountering a whole lot of friction. It is, of course, going to encounter some, but it makes it a kind of a nicer surface for the blood to flow. The middle layer is the tunica media. Mostly smooth muscle, has elastic tissue in it too. Actually, so does the intima. How much elastic tissue kind of depends on what type of blood vessel it is. And the smooth muscle, because it's a muscle, can contract and relax, and when the smooth muscle contracts or relaxes, that is what ultimately leads to the vasoconstriction and vasodilation. The deepest or kind of outermost layer here is the tunica externa. It's mostly connective tissue, has a lot of collagen fibers in it. Just kind of supports, surrounds each of the blood vessels, kind of holds them all together, firms them up a little bit. Very large arteries and very large veins. They are organs, right? Anytime you have multiple tissue types in one place, you have an organ. We do have multiple tissue types, so we do have organs. And that tissue in the walls of these blood vessels, particularly the really, really big ones, they need oxygen and nutrients too, and so they will have their own blood supply, and that's what we call the vasa vasorum, which is, literally the blood vessels of the blood vessels. So you can see an artery here, much thicker walls, tend to be more round in shape. The veins here, they tend to have much thinner walls. They tend to have these very large lumens. They also tend to have these kind of weird, funky shapes. I think because they just don't have the same kind of bulk that the veins, the arteries do. And then I do want to point out the capillary down here. The capillaries are lacking the tunica media and the tunica externa. They're basically just some endothelial cells with a little bit of connective tissue underneath for a little bit of support. So they're very thin, very thin walled. And that's a good thing, right? If that's where all exchange is taking place, then we want it to be able to diffuse in and out of the capillaries pretty easily. So there is a pressure gradient in our vascular system, mostly due to the pumping of the ventricles, particularly the left ventricle, because it's got that nice thick myocardium. And so the blood vessels that are closer to the heart tend to have more pressure. The blood vessels that are further from the heart tend to have less pressure, mostly because they've been exposed to friction more. If you're a red blood cell and you've now traveled from the heart all the way out to the toes and then back to the heart, you've encountered a lot of blood vessel wall along the way, and that encounters or causes friction, which kind of tamps down on the pressure a little bit. So the highest pressure will be in our aorta, and the lowest pressure will then be in the vena cava. If you look at the capillary pressure, you'll see that it's higher than the pressure in the veins, but lower than the pressure in the arteries, and that's actually an excellent thing for us. Remember, the capillaries are very thin-walled, sometimes just a single cell thick, and if your capillaries had the same blood pressure, for instance, as your aorta, you'd basically blow right through it and bust your capillaries, and you'd end up bleeding internally, and certainly that's not anything we want to be happening to us. Let's do some comparisons between the arteries and veins. Comparison questions are always good questions. So the arteries, again, thicker walls. So the veins then have thinner walls. The arteries tend to have a smaller lumen, although not necessarily. If you have a really large artery, just by its sheer size, it's going to have a large lumen. But the veins tend to have the kind of larger lumens. If you were looking at an artery of a similar size as a vein, the vein would likely have the larger lumen. And because of that, they are those capacitance vessels holding more of our blood at any one time. Arteries have more smooth muscle and elastic tissue than the veins do, and so there are pressure reservoirs, particularly those large arteries leaving your heart, the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. They have a lot of elastic tissue in them, and so when the ventricles pump and push that blood into them, they kind of expand a little bit as the blood moves through them, and then kind of recoil back to their original size, and that kind of keeps the pressure going. Arteries are closer to the heart. Because of that, they have a higher pressure. They do have a lot of smooth muscles, so they're going to expand and contract quite a bit, help us regulate our blood pressure. The veins are further from the heart, so they have that lower pressure. And because they have that lower pressure, they need two things. To get the blood back to the heart, particularly if we're talking about from our lower limbs, we need the skeletal muscles around them to contract and relax and kind of milk the blood back up to the heart. The veins also need valves. Because they have such lower pressure, they don't have the kind of force to make sure that blood flows in one direction, and we don't want blood kind of pooling backwards. In the arteries, they have all the force of the contraction of the ventricles behind them, and so that keeps the pressure high, that keeps the blood flowing easily and in one direction. And so we have valves present in the veins, but not present in the arteries. And in our systemic circuit, it is the arteries that are carrying oxygen-rich blood and the veins that are carrying oxygen-poor blood. So the arteries are the supply, the veins are the drainage in the systemic circuit. Remember, it's a little backwards in the pulmonary circuit. So I'm going to go and do kind of a brief overview of the arterial and venous systems, and then I have a separate lecture that goes into a little bit more detail about the specific blood vessels that we're going to test you on. So let's look at the arterial system first. This particular figure is from both your lecture text and your lab manual. And I know when you first look at it, it just looks crazy and overwhelming, but just start at the heart, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So if we start right here, and what I'm going to do with the pointer here, I actually suggest you do with your pencil. Take your textbook, take your lab manual, open up the figures, whether it's these chart-like figures or the figures where they're in a body, and take your pencil and trace the blood vessels and see how they all kind of connect to one other and how this branches off of that and goes here and so on and so forth. But we're going to start right here at the left ventricle of our heart because we're here in our systemic arterial circuit. So branching off of the, well, not branching off, but coming out of the left ventricle is the ascending aorta. Branching off of that are the coronary arteries that supply blood to the heart itself. The ascending aorta kind of turns into the aortic arch. That contains our blood supply for our whole upper body, both head and neck, and the two upper limbs. On the right side of the body, we have a brachiocephalic trunk. So this very, very short blood vessel that very, very quickly branches into the right common carotid, which goes up to the head and neck, and then the right subclavian, which then supplies blood to the right upper limb. The left side of the body is a little different. It does not have a brachiocephalic trunk. The left common carotid for head and neck and left subclavian for left upper limb branch directly off of the aortic arch. So they don't have the brachiocephalic trunk like the right side of the body does. If we follow the aortic arch again, we then get into what we call the descending aorta. The descending aorta is basically one big, long, giant tube, and depending on kind of where we are, whether we're in the thoracic cavity or whether we're in the abdominal cavity, we call it either the thoracic aorta or the abdominal aorta. Branching off of the thoracic aorta, we have the bronchial arteries, which bring blood to your lungs for them to use, all the intercostals, which go to the pleura of the lungs, a bunch of your skin, your spinal cord, a whole bunch of different kind of thoracic musculature branching off of these thoracic aorta and the intercostals. If we follow the descending aorta into the abdominal cavity, now all of a sudden we're going to call it the abdominal aorta. It's still the same tube. Branching off of the abdominal aorta are some of our phrenic and lumbar arteries, which do kind of some of the posterior abdomen and the diaphragm. But then we also have kind of all of the abdominal viscera. So the celiac trunk has several branches that go to things like the spleen and the liver and the gallbladder. You also have these mesenteric arteries that go mostly to your large and small intestines. The renal arteries and the suprarenal arteries, which go to the kidneys and the adrenal glands, and of course the gonadal arteries, which are going to your ovaries or your testes, depending on what sex you happen to be. The abdominal aorta, if we go back to the aorta here, when it gets kind of lower into your abdomen, it actually kind of stops and becomes two separate branches that are going to go down into both of the lower limbs via what we call the common iliac arteries. Okay, let's look at the venous system. Remember, this is the drainage system. So now, I instead of starting with the heart, I actually find it easier to start with whatever part of the body we happen to be draining. So if we were talking about, say, the brain, we're going to start up here and follow the blood flow eventually back to the right atrium of the heart. All of the upper systemic circulation, whether it's on the right side or the left side, merges into a brachiocephalic vein. And unlike with the arterial system, you have a left brachiocephalic vein and a right brachiocephalic vein. The left brachiocephalic vein gets all of the blood from the left side of the head and neck and left upper limb, and then on the right side we have the right brachiocephalic vein, which is getting the right side of the head and neck and upper limb. The brachiocephalic veins then merge with the superior vena cava, and the superior vena cava, of course, is going to bring it back to the heart. If we go to our kind of lower systemic circulation, if we go out to, say, the lower limb or the kidneys, we're going to follow the blood flow back into the inferior vena cava. So pretty much all of the lower systemic circuit merges with the inferior vena cava, whether it's the hepatic veins from the liver, the renal veins from the kidneys, the gonadal veins from the ovaries and testes, and then the two common iliac veins coming up from the lower limbs, they're going to merge then here into the inferior vena cava, which is then again going to bring us back to our heart. And that's kind of how this all works. Arterial supply, venous drainage.